You're listening to the Clear Creek Resources podcast from Clear Creek Community Church. To hear more, check out clearcreekresources.org.
All right, welcome everyone to the Clear Creek Resources podcast. I'm Rachel Chester. Thanks for listening today. I'm here with Ryan Lehtinen, our Egret Bay campus pastor. Thanks for being here.
Yep, glad to be here.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've been on a podcast with you.
Yeah.
It's good to have you here.
Yeah.
So we are starting a new sermon series this summer. It's a study of the book of James, which is called Real Faith.
Real
Is that
Faith,
right?
yep.
Real Faith.
12 weeks.
And so during this sermon series, we're going to have a podcast series too, where we talk with some of our pastors who are writing the sermons and giving the message for the sermons, preaching, just about sort of the background, sort of what you're thinking about and studying and just other things maybe you wanted to tell people, but you didn't have time, or your personal thoughts about it. It's going to be really fun. I'm excited about it.
Yeah, that sounds good.
And you're first up. Because you are writing and preaching this first week, which we want to encourage you to listen to the sermons. So this first one is May 17th. Is that right?
Yep.
If
Wednesday,
you're Wednesday,
May 17th, yep.
And then the 21st. If
At all the other campuses,
at all the other campuses. So make sure you listen to that sermon, so then you'll really understand everything that Ryan's talking about, because you're not going to rehash your whole sermon here.
No, unless you want me to, yeah.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah, go.
No, probably not, no.
Okay, so we're just going to run through some questions I have. And anything else you want to add, we want to hear from you, because we don't really ever get to pick y'all's brains about what it looks like to write a sermon or just the other things you're thinking about.
All right.
Okay, so first, if you had just one big takeaway from this message, just one thing you really wanted us to leave with, what would that be?
The main point of this passage really begins in verse 2, where James just says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds." And so really the main takeaway is to count it all joy. And to recognize that, we're going to go through all kinds of different trials throughout our life. And the main call here is to count it all joy. So you're trying to have joy even in the midst of all these tough times that you're going through. And then, he works through a few different reasons why. And so I have four reasons that we see in the text here why we can have joy in tough times. That it's formative for us. It grows us into the likeness of Jesus. We can learn to trust his wisdom. We can rely on his resources. And then it allows us to live for his future reward. So that's the main point.
Yeah.
That's what I hope that people came away with it.
So my next question really works well within that. We talk about the big story, the big picture of the Bible a lot, that the whole Bible is one story that leads us to Jesus. So how does this particular passage or your message, how does it connect with that big story?
Yeah. So there's a lot of stuff in here. And that's why it's fun to be able to do these podcasts, because there's things that you can't really talk about as much when you're trying to, keep it somewhat succinct on a Sunday morning or a Wednesday night. Really, the book of James is interesting because James, he's Jesus' half-brother. So we talk about that in the message some. So his background is, you see throughout the gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, he's mentioned as someone who's kind of on the outside, thinks that Jesus is a little bit crazy, right? Because he doesn't know why he's going around and doing all this itinerant ministry. Jesus is going around preaching. Then all of a sudden, when Jesus goes to the cross, he's resurrected, and then really the only other things that's mentioned about him is that now he's this leader in Jerusalem in the church, and the only thing that we see about his conversion is that he at some point is a witness to the resurrection. So Paul mentions that that Jesus appeared to him as well as the other apostles. So at some point there, James sees his resurrected brother and realizes that he is the Messiah. So that's why James begins by talking about he is the Lord Jesus Christ, that he is the Christ, he's the Messiah that's been they've been awaiting since the very beginning. That James finally realizes that, and so James is kind of known as this book of wisdom. And so he's drawn on a lot of things from the Old Testament and Proverbs. He's also really straightforward with people. Like, he doesn't have a lot of like fun little stories and anecdotes in there. Like, he just tells it like it is. And part of it is because he's writing to people who are being persecuted and they're going through trials of various kinds. So he's trying to challenge them and encourage them. And I would say the main challenge in all of this, or the main encouragement in all of this, kind of gets to the question of where does this fit in the big story of God throughout the Bible? Is James is directing our focus to like the end times. And so that's what you see throughout this, even just the call to remain steadfast, to have its full effect will make you perfect, complete, lacking in nothing, which is not something that we'll experience in this life, but we grow towards to eventually stand before God fully glorified, where we get to experience a perfect, complete, lacking in nothing kind of experience. And then the very last verse of the passage for this week was, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him." And so again, just directing our focus that from the very beginning, this has been God's plan to eventually, we stand before him and we have the crown of life on our heads that we even see pictured in Revelation. So that's kind of the big picture that James has, and the role of suffering and going through trials and all that is really formative for us, that has a part in us eventually realizing that fully glorified state before God.
Yeah,
as confusing as that might be for us while we're in it. So, yeah.
Which is amazing. So there's a few different types of theology, just to sort of give everyone a framework of what we're talking about. That was biblical theology, the big story. There's also systematic theology. So that's just talking about specific doctrines, specific topics that we study in the Bible, that the Bible speaks to us about. So in that category, are there any doctrines or just ideas that stand out in this chapter that you were studying? Yeah,
I mean, when I talk about how one of the reasons we can count it all joy is the steadfastness, and when steadfastness has its full effect, we become perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. Just the idea of sanctification, that's just the theological concept that it's all of the Christian life is growing in holiness to become more and more like Christ. That's God's original intent in the creation, is that we are created in his image, and because of sin, we are broken. And then when we come to faith in Jesus, we have the Holy Spirit now dwelling in us. And then so we are growing in holiness in that sanctification process to eventually be glorified before him when he comes to restore all things. So I'd say that's, that one is definitely in there. There's all kinds of things in there that you could probably point to as well, but that's probably the main systematic theology concept that would be helpful to think more about.
Yeah, and that's even just helpful just to understand, these aren't doctrines these are doctrines that you're thinking about already.
Yeah.
What is the point? Why is there suffering, all those things?
Yep.
Yeah. So I know that you guys spend a lot of time preparing for Wednesday nights and Sunday mornings. And you already mentioned you don't have the time to say everything maybe you want to say. So what are the things that you wish you could be telling people about or going into more about on Sunday that you just didn't have time to say?
Even as I just kind of work through the passage here, I mean, there's some things that are just around the background of James that, man, the more that you look into it, it's just fascinating to look into it. I mean, so one of those is just the apologetic or the firmness of your faith and looking at like the New Testament witnesses, James and Paul and Peter and people who are like that. James to me stands out as far as people who are questioning how true all of this might be, is that here's a guy that he was born and raised with Jesus. If anyone was just going to say, yeah, all that stuff is crazy, like I grew up in the same room as this guy, it would be James. And yet here's a guy that he was executed for his faith. that his brother was the Messiah, the Lord Jesus Christ. And so, just to think about, this guy didn't just go to his grave. He went to he had a terrible end to his life because of what he believed in. And so just to be able to talk about that more and really let that sink in, this is a faith that he believed in so deeply that he gave his life for this. And so, we're reading the words of somebody who believed that deeply. When you get into what does it mean to have trials of various kinds, there's a lot of deep work that you can do on that, because what he means by various kinds is the whole spectrum of things that we experience in our life, from the worst of the worst to just the little annoyances and conflicts that we might have throughout our life. Like he's saying, you're going to go through all kinds of different trials, and yet throughout it all, count it all joy. And so, it's just hard to in a short message that we have a lot of text to get through, to really spend a lot of time talking about, okay, that end of the spectrum of trials, that is, pain and suffering, that's the stuff that in a church family we're seeing all the time. We're walking with people through the loss of a loved one and going through cancer treatment, and you name it. And so there's just a whole lot of stuff that you could get into that it's just hard to get into in one message. This book, Tim Keller wrote a book called Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering. Extremely helpful, very good book. I've got this thing underlined. It's really, really good. I use it a little bit as a resource for this one, but again, it's just, there's only so deep you can get into that particular aspect of trials. And so that's something that I wish I could have spent more time on, but again, you only get so much real estate in your message. So, but little tidbits are always in there. I know that, one of the things that's kind of fun to hear about is the word, he talks about not being double-minded, verse 8, chapter 1, verse 8, that's someone who is, double-minded man, unstable in all his ways, someone who's basically questioning God, they're doubting, they're not asking with complete faith. The word that James uses is a word that it first appears in the book of James in all Greek literature. So it may have been used in other ways in other times, maybe just people spoke it around, but there's no other written record of it before James. And I think it's the word disychos or something like that. So it's the word sukos or psychos, meaning soul. And so he's saying it's double soul, two souls. You have this, this split within your soul where you're trying to trust God, but you're not fully trusting God. And that describes a lot of what we struggle with, that there's this part of us that is trying to live into this faith where we're trusting in Jesus and believing that what he has is good, that he is able and willing to answer our prayers. And then yet we're just kind of hedging our bets a little bit. We want to try to trust in our own resources, trust our own plans, what the world might have for us, just in case Jesus isn't really enough, or he's not really going to answer the way we want to. And so, just that word double-minded is good if you really dig into what does it mean for you. So,
well, really, just everything you're talking about to me sort of has the same idea, suffering, but this ultimate hope, sanctification, but we're still double-minded. It really, a lot of what you're talking about is the already not yet in the story. So that all, it makes me want to study it more just listening to you talk about it.
Oh, yeah. And then, I don't know how much you want to go on this, but verse 9 through 11, when he starts getting into the rich and the poor, and don't spend a whole lot of time on that because he gets into rich and poor a little bit later on. So kind of, trying to save a little bit for people who are going to be preaching a little bit later on. But the idea that suffering is a leveling thing for everybody. It's it doesn't matter if you're rich or you're poor. You're going to go through trials of various kinds. And so if you are trying to rest in your own resources, in your own planning, and your own security that you get from your finances and the status that you might get from that, I mean, I love the way he talks about it. He's like, you're going to pass away like the flowers of the grass, right? The sun's going to rise, and you have the scorching heat, or I think the word there is more like the scorching wind, and the grass is going to wither, and the flowers fall, the beauty perishes. So will the rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuits. And so when he's talking about the pursuits there, he's talking about like the business transactions of this rich man. So he's got all these deals going, and he's like, it's all just going to fade away. It's like what you're trusting in, it's all just going to be gone one day. And what are you going to have? And so he's, the call is to have really the same faith as the person who's poor, to not to be focusing on your own resources, whether you have them or you don't have them, but to focus on trust in Jesus, and then that allows you to have this joy even in the midst of wherever you find yourself.
Yeah, suffering or wealth.
So, yeah.
It does sound like wisdom literature, like you said. I mean, you can see him pulling from that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else? You can say as much as you want to say.
I mean, one of the things with James, he's well acquainted with the teachings of Jesus. And so there's all these echoes of particularly the Sermon on the Mount. And so even in verse 12, as it wraps up, blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. It's kind of this echoing of Beatitudes from the very beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. So, how to live the blessed life,
And nothing is random in Scripture. I love hearing where all the connections are. It's so helpful. Okay, so if we're going to take everything you're talking about and your sermon, and we're going to live that practically out, what does that look like?
Yeah. I mean, it really comes down to how do you view the trials in your life? Do you view them as setbacks or barriers for what you're ultimately trying to accomplish for your own life? Or do you see that God has a whole different perspective on all those things, that he actually is trying to accomplish a different perspective or different purpose for your life? He's trying to ultimately bring you into the fullness of the experience of him. And so all these trials, from his perspective, they're not setbacks, and they're not detours, but they're actually part of what he's trying to do. He's accelerating that process of trying to make you more and more like Christ. And that changes our perspective. Tim Keller, he talks about how joy and sadness are not opposites from each other, that the Bible in many places talk about how joy and sadness actually can happen at the same time. But joy is like this buoyancy that keeps you afloat when you are being tossed around and you're getting wet from all the waves. You don't sink. And so, practically, it looks like us being reminded of that truth. And I would also say that part of living into this is to do the necessary prep work in your life in those times where you're not going through trials of various kinds, because one day they will happen. And so, that's one thing I talked about in the message is trials and pain and suffering, all the things that we might go through, they have a tendency to either strengthen our faith or to harden our heart. And when you're not going through those different trials, that's the time to continue to work on strengthening your faith, because when they do come, it makes you less likely to have this hardened heart that, where the ship sinks, because you just have nothing to really anchor into your soul. Sorry, I'm mixing metaphors between buoyancy and anchor there, but
it works.
It works, yeah. So I would say practically to really think about, what does it look like for me to follow Jesus, even if I'm not going through trials? Like if it's like, man, everything's going great, like family's good and like life is going well, it's like, be preparing for the storm. I mean, we know what it's like to live in an area where it's like hurricane season, and they're when you're in May or June and they start sending out the things and saying, all right, get ready for hurricane season, make sure you have this, and it's like, yeah, that's part of our life is you prepare for things that might happen. And James is saying, well, this will happen in some form, various kinds. And so what does it look like for you to practically prepare your faith for those different trials that you might come to? And so be in community and reading the Bible and growing in prayer, practicing your faith where you're growing closer and closer to Jesus. Surrendering your resources to God, giving generously to God. That helps you to not trust in your own resources, but giving it to Him. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God. Everybody lacks wisdom. So continue to ask God for wisdom in how you're handling anything that you're going through as this practice of I'm trusting in Him, that no matter what happens when I go through these trials, that's my default, is I'm going to God and asking for wisdom, and I'm asking for Him to work things out for His glory and my good. And yeah.
Yeah, I love that too, because it's not preparing for storms out of fear; it's preparing for storms from hope.
Yeah.
That's what you first said. This is about hope and what God is doing in us and is going to do ultimately. So that's just completely different than fear. So what about for you? Individually, you personally, how did preparing and studying and giving this message, how did it change your heart?
I think that main verse, count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, that's a hard thing to actually live out. It sounds really good, count it all joy. The word all there is like, it's about, it's almost like describing a degree of joy. So it's like, it's the fullness of joy. It's pure joy is really what that's trying to describe there. So count it this as pure joy. I don't know if we can really fully ever really appreciate that when we go through trials of various kinds. So just trying to just think for my own life, do I really believe that? And what does that really look like for me? Being in the role that I'm in, it's like I see and I hear and I walk with people who are going through trials of various kinds. And it's, and so you see like the heartache and you see the pain and the suffering. And just to kind of think practically, like how is my own heart prepared for things like that? How does that then shape how I'm walking with other people who are going through that and caring for them and trying to grow in empathy? So yeah, it's just it's a sobering thing when you think about what trials of various kinds mean to people. Mean to people who are reading James then and now and all the centuries in between. What
abstract.
People have gone through. So yeah, just letting that press into my heart more and more.
Well, thank you. Thanks for all of the work you put into it and for your sermon and for this conversation. Super fun and super helpful.
Yep.
So
thank you.
Thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks for checking out this video. If you haven't yet, make sure that you hit subscribe down below and check out ClearCreekResources.org, where we have videos, books, and sermons on there, as well as our audio podcast. Thanks for watching.